At the international level, the negotiations, I would say, are not going well. Every year there's a new conference of the parties. There's now COP25 or whatever number we're up to, where 200 nations get together and discuss this, and they're not making good headway.
This is the Gies Download, a podcast from the University of Illinois' Gies College of Business. I'm your host, Tim Sinclair, and today our guest is Don Fullerton, an author, researcher, and professor of finance, as well as agricultural and consumer economics at Gies. In a nutshell, Don studies the effects of environmental policy on the economy. Then he presents that research to world leaders and decision makers to help them craft laws and adjust taxes, which ideally ease our impact on the world we live in and fairly distribute those costs. Heading into college, however, this career path would have come as a surprise to Don.
I guess I always thought that I would be an academic, and I didn't take any economics until my sophomore year, and then I was sort of a B student or C's in some things until I took economics and started getting A's in that. So I thought, oh, okay, maybe there's a natural proclivity there.
40 years later, it turns out those good grades in economics were no fluke.
My field now is environmental economics and policy, and my focus within that field is about the economic effects of environmental policy, such as a carbon tax or other ways to reduce polluting emissions. So it could be a tax on emissions, or it could be a cap and trade system, or there's other policies, energy policies, that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, such as energy standards and fuel economy standards and energy efficiency requirements.
It's both complex and delicate work, and it's work that perhaps I oversimplified in my earlier description.
The kinds of studies I'm doing now go back to where I started in this profession 40 years ago, which was not in environmental economics at all, but in public economics, where I was looking at effects of taxation, including all different U.S. taxes. And I was kind of a tax guy, looking at corporate income taxes, for example, and effects on investment incentives, and effects on the distribution of after-tax income. So in other words, how much do all these taxes redistribute from rich to poor, or vice versa, and simulating the effects of a carbon tax on how much they'd have to pay for gasoline or electricity and other goods, and adding up all those costs on each different kind of household.
So every environmental action has an economic effect, I would imagine, in some way, shape, or form, and your job is to try to determine how much and what impact that has on the American family?
Well, exactly, with different kinds of families. There's been a lot of focus on whether a carbon tax is regressive. There's kind of a presumption, for example, that a carbon tax takes a higher fraction the burden is a higher fraction of income for those with low income, because, low-income families have to have electricity, and they have to have a certain amount of heat and gasoline and other things that use fossil fuels, but their income's very low, so that burden might add up to a high fraction of their income. And then at the other end of the spectrum, rich people have a lot more income, and so they certainly buy more of all those things, more gasoline and electricity, but it's a lower fraction of their high income. So the burden as a fraction of income is falling with income, and that's what we call a regressive tax system. The burden's higher, as a fraction of income, the burden's higher on the poor than it is on the rich.
Your job is to find out the numbers, just get the information, or are you working to then try to impact change once you've come up with these conclusions?
My academic research is strictly objective, and I don't try to advocate for policy in my academic research. I just try to get published in the best economic and policy journals and business journals. There's a good reason for that, which is that if you sort of let any of your personal political views seep into your research, then, half the people that read it might like that just fine, but half the people who read it are going to, are going to dislike it. and discount the research. But that's a wrong reason to be discounting my research. So the research is perfectly valid. I want it to be objective, to look objective, so that everybody can accept it at face value, not just the people who like the results.
And that research often finds its way to the very highest levels of both state and federal government.
I have worked with members of Congress and other policymakers. I've had research contracts with the U.S. Treasury Department. I've had meetings in Washington at Senator Durbin's office. I've met with basically all the foreign ministers of the European Union to talk about these results. And I hope they use the information widely or carefully in their deliberations and in their policymaking. But my job is not to tell them what to do. I'm not going to tell Senator Durbin how he should vote in Congress. He would think that ridiculous, right? He knows more about that than I do, about how he should vote in the Senate. And I don't even want to imply that I'm telling him how to vote. I'm just going to give him the information and hope he uses it for good policymaking.
I remember, and it's probably still happening, but I remember the mandates coming out from Congress saying we're going to have to raise mile per gallon rates to certain thresholds by certain years in order to be more environmentally friendly. But there's obviously an economic impact of that, right? Because it's more expensive for manufacturers to build cars in that way. Can you talk through a little bit maybe of what you found, whether in that example or others, about how the push and pull, the yin and yang of these two things sort of work together, and why there is a benefit, economically speaking, to being more environmentally friendly?
A lot of economics really just kind of can be explained in simple terms as measuring the cost, measuring the benefits, and see which is larger. And in order to compare them in that way, we have to sort of convert all the costs and all the benefits into the same unit of measure, whatever that is. See which stacks up higher. And so a typical convenient unit of measure is dollars, but that doesn't mean that the dollar is king and everything has to be in dollars. I've seen other people measuring the costs and benefits in lives saved or lives lost. You're just counting lives. But doing cost-benefit analysis for something like carbon policy means looking at all the costs, as I have done, costs on families, costs of that of the carbon-reducing technology. For example, the fuel standards that you mentioned. I mean, those things have costs, as you say, and all of the other energy efficiency standards on appliances have costs, and all of the things that businesses do to try to use renewables instead of fossil fuels have costs. And so we need to add up all those costs, and not just the dollar cost, but the loss in consumer surplus, the disadvantage to consumers of not being able to buy what they want. And then on the other side, I don't work so much on the other side about benefits, but the benefits of carbon policy is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And, everything I can tell from the natural scientists that are working on that, we've got a horrendous problem looming. Within a few years, it's a lot closer than it used to be. We used to talk about multiple decades away when we were going to face this problem, but it doesn't seem that far away anymore. The climate's already changing, and we're going to have huge costs of adaptation. We're going to have huge costs from hurricanes, storms, sea level rise. My work by itself is mostly on some of the economic costs within the United States of having a climate policy within the United States, and who bears those costs. But you have to bear in mind that, all the studies indicate that the benefits of reducing climate change greatly exceed the costs of reducing climate change.
So how do you, and I know this is not your job specifically, but for whether it's an individual who's just trying to decide whether they're going to drive a car that's more fuel efficient or recycle or whatever, when there's costs involved with that, convincing them that those dollars are well spent, even though it's cheaper to do it the other way for them right now, or maybe even a small country who you're trying to get involved in something more globally, that can't be an easy sell for people with limited resources How have you seen that sort of play out in your different conversations with people around the world?
At the international level, the negotiations, I would say, are not going well. There have been, every year there's a new conference of the parties. There's now COP 25 or whatever number we're up to, where 200 nations get together and discuss this, and they're not making good headway. And the problem is that the poor countries can't afford to do anything, and the rich countries, kind of don't want to pay for all the costs that would be imposed upon the poor countries. I mean, the U.S. and other developed countries, each of the countries of Europe, for example, might well be willing to pay for their own costs of reducing their own greenhouse gas emissions, but the poor countries cannot pay for their own costs because, they just can't afford it. They have people who are dirt poor, and they're worried about nutrition and health and survival. Probably the rich countries are going to have to chip in more than their own costs to help pay for the costs of all those poor countries if they want the poor countries to do anything. And of course, reducing climate change is going to require everybody, all nations, to participate in efforts. So that's not going well. And when I look at the national level at the U.S., that's not necessarily going well either because of politics and the hairline majority in the Senate who might want to have some kind of climate policy.
Well, it sounds like it might be the same problem that you're seeing on the global level, where rich families don't want to pay for the poor families. They might want to pay for their own, but they don't want to foot the bill for more than their fair share, quote unquote.
Well, that's right. I mean, everybody does have some self-interest involved, and they're looking at their own pocketbook. But, I have kind of two reasons still for some optimism, at least within the U.S., and maybe worldwide. One is that the climate's already changing. I mean, people in Illinois know that it's multiple degrees Fahrenheit hotter during the summer than it used to be. And they know it's actually colder in the winter than it used to be as well. And the storms are worse. And, the city of Chicago is inundated with, they're going to have to redo all their storm drains and huge infrastructure investments along the rivers to try to keep flooding within the banks. And that's just Illinois. I mean, you can see the damage around the rest of the country along the coasts. We're going to be losing the Everglades in Florida. There's a heat wave in the Pacific Northwest last summer that was, they're not used to temperatures over 90, let alone over 100. And there were plenty of places in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia that were up well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit for multiple days. It was killing people. And, so you read the newspaper, that's happening, and things are starting to come around in terms of the willingness to vote for a package, either by individual voters or their representatives, vote for a package where you take everything into account and say, look, I don't like bearing these extra costs of gasoline or the extra costs of electricity, but we got to do something. And so I think people are learning, and so there's reason for optimism there. The other reason for optimism is the huge technological changes we've been seeing. Electric cars are getting better and cheaper. The battery technology is getting better and cheaper. The solar technology is getting better and cheaper. And the wind turbines you see all over Illinois now. And the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity generated by those renewable technologies is falling hand over fist year after year. Now, it may not quite be cheaper than coal yet, but it started 10 times the cost of coal or more. It was just hugely expensive to try to generate electricity from wind power or solar power. And there was a lot of discussion about it, and people saying, yeah, we need to encourage renewables because the coal and other fossil fuel emissions are killing the climate. We're going to need to favor these renewables. But if it's 10 times the cost, you can hardly get anywhere with that. And yet it's been falling. It's only it's going to it's going to fall below the cost of coal. And just because of technological advancement, not even because of policy. So in other words, we may not have to force electricity generators to use renewable power, and we may not have to force people to buy electric cars, or and they're still subsidized now, trying to encourage it, but the cost difference is much smaller than it used to be, and it just could go the other way and get cheaper. So in fact, I sometimes wonder if the only thing going to save us from climate change is better and faster and cheaper technology.
Well, I feel like more people are capitalists than environmentalists, right?
Yeah, probably true.
So the solution here then is on a policy level and help encouraging, forcing, however you want to use the word, companies to follow through on stricter standards for being environmentally responsible.
Well, yes, but given the changes in technology, it might not take much of a policy bump. It might just be, certain incentives, and we have subsidies for renewables and subsidies for buying electric cars, and there's discussion of those things. But there's other kinds of policies that are not too much of a force, or a mandate, but more like a nudge or an encouragement, and especially information. So, the government can, without forcing people to do anything, the government can do a better job of just getting the information out there about what these options are, and where you can do some recycling, and where you can save yourself some money by buying an energy efficient appliance or a more fuel efficient car. And it's a real communications issue. And, all governments, U.S. federal government, each state government, even counties and cities can be, on the lookout for ways to convey better the information about, and to help coordinate across households, get a neighborhood involved and get people thinking about it, and to get people looking down the road a little bit, because when you look ahead 5 or 10 years, not just about how much worse climate change is going to be in 5 or 10 years, but even in terms of your own costs, you can see the price of fossil fuels going up, gasoline prices getting worse. And if you look over a 5 or 10 year horizon, sometimes even shorter, you can see that spending more for a fuel efficient car, you'll come out better in the long run. The present value of the gasoline savings would exceed the extra cost that you're paying now for an electric car or a fuel-efficient car, hybrid, or something that would use less gasoline.
I asked Don if anything in his research ever surprised him, or would surprise most people. His response was an emphatic yes, especially as it related to putting a tax on fossil fuels and who specifically would incur those costs. And I'll admit, it definitely surprised me.
If the fossil fuels go up in cost by 1%, then almost all commodities go up by almost 1% in terms of the cost of production, because they're all using fossil fuels. And then when you look at who buys those commodities, there's not that much difference in the mixture of commodities purchased between the high income and the low income. I mean, it's not just, in other words, it's not just gasoline that's more expensive. It's everything that's a little more expensive, like 1% more expensive at the low income group. And everything's about 1% more expensive in the high income group. So everybody has got almost a 1% burden. So it's kind of flat. It's not pro-poor or pro-rich. But the second thing that happens is that the federal transfer programs are indexed to the price level. So, for example, Social Security benefits that are a high fraction of income for low-income families, those go, through the cost of living adjustments. So if the carbon tax were to raise the price of all commodities by, a little bit more and less here and there, but all between 0.5% and 1%, then families that don't get any public transfers from government are not protected. They're going to bear the cost of that. But everybody who gets public transfers from the government, including, for example, Social Security benefits with cost of living adjustments, they're going to get higher receipt of those transfers to cover their extra costs. So they're protected. And so low-income people are, to different degrees for each family, but they're protected by the fact that their benefits go up with the price level, and then everybody else beyond the low-income group are not protected by those public transfers. So the burden's at the high end rather than the low end. So it's not even a regressive tax, it's progressive.
Being able to explain something so complex so clearly is just one example of why Don is an excellent professor. But he also happens to really love it.
I like teaching the undergraduates there in Gies because they're really smart. They have had diverse backgrounds. They want to be intellectually challenged, and they like the ideas, just like I did when I was an undergraduate.
What was it about this specific opportunity with Gies that made you think this is something you wanted to add to your plate?
Well, I started out in economics departments within a college like the Liberal Arts and Sciences, where there is an economics department at Illinois. And I've also taught at public policy schools. So that's my field. I do tax policy and environmental policy. And so I've kind of tried each of those. I mean, I taught economics students, I taught public policy students. And when, it was, more than a dozen years ago, Jeff Brown was at Illinois, and I had known him already at that point for 15 or 20 years. Frankly, I knew him since he was in graduate school and I was a professor. And he knew me, and so he knew I'd been doing economics and public policy for a long time. And he told me his new center was going to try to cover for teaching and research the kinds of public policies that are of interest to business. And that includes tax policy, which I had done a lot of work on, including corporate tax incentives and effects on investment, and environmental policy, which I had done a lot on, and retirement policy, because as I also mentioned, I'd worked on Social Security. I took a look and talked to people, and I thought, now here's a way to have a more major impact on the people that are out there in the field doing it, that are in business, that are making these decisions, that have to interact not only with customers and suppliers and, supply chain, but also have to interact with government, right? They face these policies and they have to make their own corporate kind of strategy decisions to deal with all these policies I just listed. And they have to make sense of them. So they are going to want to know, okay, why is government trying, what is government doing and why are they doing it to me? So, it was new for me being in a business school, frankly. And I was, ready for a new challenge, and it has been rewarding.
Thankfully, Don's work has proved rewarding for far more people than just himself. And you can see the results, from students to senators and economics classes to economics policies. Be sure to join us for the next Gies Download. In the meantime, you can learn more about the Gies College of Business at giesbusiness.illinois.edu.